All right, today we're opening a cold case file, one that's been sitting on the shelf for 2,000 years. We're launching a full forensic investigation into one of the most explosive global movements in history. And our job is simple: figure out if its massive expansion was just a series of historical accidents or the meticulous execution of a pre-calculated plan.
So, that's the big question, right? Was this some kind of grassroots movement that just happened to catch fire? Or were the key players, the early operators, following a script, a blueprint that had been laid out centuries before they were even born? The whole answer really hinges on how we decide to analyze the evidence.
Now, to do this investigation properly, we have to set aside any modern ideas about prophecy being some vague, mystical prediction. Instead, we're going to treat these ancient texts exactly like the early operators did, as a verifiable strategic document. Think of it as a repository of historical data that they used for validation and for mission guidance.
In this definition, well, it's everything for our analysis. We are treating prophecy as a map. So, if an event in the 1st century perfectly matches coordinates laid out in a text from, say, the 7th century BC, that creates what investigators call a fixed point, a solid marker of reliability. It's kind of like finding a fingerprint at a crime scene today that matches a record from 100 years ago. It suggests there's a single, coherent design at work.
You see, the first operators of this movement didn't build their case on feelings or subjective experiences. Not at all. They started with data. The historical record is very clear that they used this rigorous process of proving from the scriptures. When the Apostle Peter stands up at Pentecost to explain the absolutely wild events unfolding around them, he doesn't offer his personal opinion. No, he cites the prophet Joel. He's basically telling the crowd, hey, the data you are seeing with your own eyes today perfectly matches the blueprint that was provided centuries ago.
Okay, so if prophecy was their blueprint, what was the tool they used to actually assemble the proof? How did they build their case? Well, the record points to a very specific method, a kind of logical assembly they used to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. It was called Symbibazon.
You really have to appreciate the raw power of this term. Symbibazon. It's not about gentle persuasion. It literally means to drive together, to compact pieces of evidence so forcefully that the conclusion becomes totally inescapable. When Saul of Tarsus, later the Apostle Paul, began his work in Damascus, the text says he used this exact method to confound his opponents, knitting together ancient prophecy and current events into an absolutely unbreakable logical chain.
So here's how it worked. It was basically a 3-step forensic procedure. Super clear, super logical. Step 1, you identify the requirement. You isolate the specific, testable criteria right out of the ancient texts. Step 2, you present the record. You pull together all the verifiable historical facts and eyewitness testimony. And then, step 3, you drive them together. You force those two data sets into contact until only one conclusion is even logically possible. That was their method for proving their case.
You know, in any major operation, there's always a critical pivot point, that one moment where a single decision changes the entire trajectory of everything that comes after. For this movement, that moment was a high-stakes legal council that took place around AD 49, and the outcome would decide if the mission stayed a small, local, ethnic sect or if it went global.
So, picture this, the Jerusalem Council. And let's be clear, this wasn't some friendly theological chat. This was a full-blown jurisdictional crisis. Operatives out in the field were reporting a massive influx of non-Jewish converts, and the leadership back in Jerusalem, they were completely fractured on what to do. Did these new people need to become culturally and ritually Jewish to be included? The entire future of the mission was hanging in the balance.
So how do you solve a crisis like this? Well, the lead adjudicator, a man named James, he settles the dispute. But he doesn't do it with some new revelation or by taking a vote. He does it by presenting a single piece of textual evidence, a legal precedent pulled straight from the ancient blueprint, quoting the prophet Amos. This one line was the linchpin of his entire ruling.
And this right here, is the heart of his legal argument. I want you to notice the critical difference between two ancient versions of the very same text. The standard Hebrew text says the restored kingdom would possess the remnant of Edom, Edom being Israel's historic enemy. But the Greek translation, the Septuagint, which was used all the time back then, has a fascinatingly different reading, that the rest of mankind may seek the Lord.
And make no mistake, this wasn't some typo. This was an absolutely brilliant legal maneuver. By citing the widely accepted Greek version, James argued that the original blueprint never intended a military conquest of Edom, but a spiritual inclusion of all mankind. This textual variant became the legal precedent, the Gentile Gate as it were, that officially authorized the mission to go global.
All right, let's pivot from high-level legal strategy to a specific case file on the ground. Forensic investigators, they often look for something called an undesigned coincidence. It's a subtle, almost incidental detail that's just too specific and too ironic to have been made up. It acts as a powerful marker of historical authenticity.
Our case file opens on a remote desert road. An agent named Philip is told to approach a high-ranking Ethiopian official, and the details we get are incredibly precise. The man is a court treasurer, he's a eunuch, and he's sitting in his chariot reading aloud from a scroll of the prophet Isaiah.
And this is the exact passage he was reading, the one he just couldn't wrap his head around. It's a description of a suffering figure who's executed and whose family line is apparently cut off. The text poses the question directly. Who can even speak of his descendants?
So when you lay it all out, the undesigned coincidence here is just staggering. On one hand, you have the subject, the official. He's a eunuch, which means he is physically incapable of having descendants. He has no family line. And what's he reading? A prophetic text about a Messiah who is also cut off, seemingly leaving no descendants behind. The profound irony is that a man with no hope for a physical lineage finds his future in a savior who, by all appearances, had none either. I mean, that detail is just too specific, too psychologically perfect to be something you just make up. It really feels like a forensic marker of a real event.
So after all this, where does the evidence lead? What's the takeaway from our investigation? Well, when we assemble all of these different data points, a really clear and consistent pattern starts to emerge, what the operators themselves would have called the unbroken thread.
Let's just quickly run through the key findings from our case file. First, prophecy wasn't used as some kind of vague mysticism, it was used as a verifiable strategic blueprint. Second, they employed a rigorous logical method, Symbibazon, to literally drive together evidence and proof. Third, a critical legal pivot, the opening of that Gentile Gate, was decided by a forensic analysis of ancient textual variants. And finally, the historical record itself is embedded with these undesigned coincidences that act as powerful markers of its reliability.
Look, the evidence we've just walked through strongly suggests that the explosive growth of this movement was no historical accident. It points to the execution of a plan. And that forces us to ask one last, really big question for our case file. If the foundation is this calculated, this forensically consistent, what does that imply about the structural integrity of the entire historical record it produced? The investigation continues.